hope these beginning lessons in chess open up a whole new world for the rest of your life. And I consider, well, it's not just my opinion, it is the greatest game in the world. It's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Games come and go, board games, video games, they all have their fads. Chess is still continuing on. In hundreds of years from now, when the entertainment industry is something else, people will still be playing chess. I'm 56 years old. I learned when I was about 14. So for over 40 years, I played. I quit for a few years, but I went back. Once you're a player, you're always a player. It's great for developing mental calculation skills for young people as well as seniors. There's chess in schools now in many big cities in the United States. They're opening up the minds of tens of thousands of young people. It teaches them to think before they act. Actions have consequences. It helps them concentrate. Their grades go up dramatically in math and other subjects. And it's great for seniors as well. I've seen many studies that it helps at least cut back Alzheimer's disease. Unfortunately, it doesn't stop it, but it delays it. There's so many things that I could go on and on about how chess is helpful in society and as individuals. It's huge in Europe. There's chess in schools in Great Britain and all across Eastern Europe. It's picking up steam. I've read it is the most popular game in the world, and I believe that sincerely. It's inexpensive. A set and a board is less than $20. And how can you have a young child and have him entertained and concentrate and help his mind for hundreds of hours for $20? Can't do it. But chess can. And it opens up social things for children in tournaments and interactions. It teaches sportsmanship. It teaches determination. I could go on, but I think you get the idea. Chess is, without a doubt, the greatest game in the world. Hi folks, John Cordisco back again with another great chess video for you. This is going to be something a little different. This is going to be for beginning players that are just starting to play chess, or people that are thinking about playing chess. You have to know the rules of any game or any sport in order to participate, and chess is no different. In order to increase the popularity of the game, I think people knowing the rules are incredibly important. And we're going to start with the king. The king is the most important piece that you'll have. He's not the most powerful piece. The most powerful piece is the queen. But the king is the most important piece for one simple reason. If you lose your king, if your king is checked by another piece and you cannot get out of it, it's checkmate. The king is dead and the game is over. So that's why he's the most important piece, but not the most powerful piece. A king can move in any direction, one space, barring, of course, there's no other piece occupying that space. No two pieces can occupy the same space. And the black king, of course, the same way. These are the spaces that the king can go to. Except for this space. None of the white king and the black king cannot move to this space here. One simple reason, the king, the opposing king, is guarding that space. You cannot move in what they call check. He would be attacked by the king if either the white king or the black king moved on the yellow square. And that's the moves of the king. And we're going to go through the individual pieces, and then we're going to show you some other things. So that's the moves of the king, and we're going to move on to the next piece. Now let's talk about the lowly foot soldiers of chess, the chess battle, the lowly pawn. Back in the late 1800s, many top world grandmasters, one in particular, I don't recall his name, called the pawns the soul of chess, and I happen to agree. Like any other battle, any other war, it's the lowly foot soldiers that do most of the fighting and dying and in a battle, and chess is no different. Let's go over a few things with a pawn. how the pawn moves first. We'll go through that. A pawn always moves forward. He cannot go backwards. Always forward. He cannot go diagonally when he moves. Only forward. Let's give you an idea. Move the pawn there. Black moves. Now you're wondering, hey, you just moved the white pawn 1 square and the black pawn moved 2 squares. Well, at the beginning of the game, when the pawns are on the second rank on each of their sides, the pawn has to make a decision. The player has to make a decision whether to move 1 square or 2 squares. You're only allowed to move 2 squares on your very first move. Let me give you an idea what I mean. Say white moves his pawn here and black moves here. Now this pawn, or this pawn, which we've already moved, you cannot move him 2 squares. He's already gone, he's already moved. You've lost that right. The only other pawns now that are allowed to move 2 squares are any of these pawns here now, when it's white's move. Any of these pawns here are allowed to move 2 squares. Now, they're not required to move 2 squares. They can move 1 or 2 squares depending on what you decide. Or they cannot move at all. Let's go through how a pawn captures. This is a little confusing for beginners because the pawn is the only piece on the chessboard that captures an opponent's piece differently than it moves. Let me say that again because it's confusing for beginning players. The pawn is the only piece on the chessboard that captures differently than it moves. And let me give you an illustration. Pawn here. Now we all know that this pawn can move forward 1, and we know he can't move diagonally or backwards or sideways or any other way and backwards. But what he can do is he can capture that pawn. Now you said, well, you just got done saying that he can't move diagonally. He can. He can only move diagonally when he's capturing another opponent's piece. It doesn't have to be a pawn, could be a rook, could be a bishop, could be a queen, could be a knight, could be anything. And that's the confusing part for beginners. Now it's white's move. White can do one of two things. He can move this pawn here, or he can capture. We'll say he moves the pawn. Now he cannot capture this pawn here. So we'll say black moves to here. Now white has a decision. He can either move this pawn here, or he can capture. But he can't do both. Or he can just leave the pawn there and move something else. We're going to capture. And that's the toughest part for beginners that are playing chess, is the fact that pawns are the only piece on the chessboard that capture an opponent's piece differently than they move. Now let's move on to some other characteristics of the pawn. One of my favorite pieces, by the way. Now let's continue on with the so-called lowly pawn. This is probably one of the most confusing rules in chess concerning pawns. There are players, I'm in my 50s, there are players who have been playing 20 or 30 years and not know this rule. It comes up on occasion, but not that often. It is called in passant, and that's French for in passing. Now, I'm going to show you what I mean. Well, I guess black moves first, doesn't matter. Black moves, white moves. We'll say black moves, white moves, black moves, and white moves his pawn here. Now it's black's move. Say black wanted to move his pawn here. 2 spaces, which you can do on the first move, of course, and bypassing the white pawn here. All right, so let's do that. If your pawn is on the 5th rank. Count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I say the 5th rank, I mean from your side of the board. Of course, the 5th rank for black is here. You always count from your side of the board. This pawn can capture that pawn. See it disappear? It was a rule that was changed, my understanding, if I remember correctly, in back several hundred years ago in medieval Europe. It's called en passant. Now let's look at this again. The pawn went there. Now, here's the decision that white has to make. It doesn't have to capture it en passant. It can just leave it and say white moves here, white moves here, black moves here. Now say, well, I feel like capturing this pawn now, en passant. You can't. When you have an en passant situation like we had a few moves ago, you have to take the pawn, if you want to, en passant at that moment. Once you move another piece, that opportunity is gone and the pawns just stay. So let me review. If a pawn that's on the 5th rank, we count them 5 from the back row, and black moves his pawn 2 spaces that go by your white pawn, now you have an opportunity to play en passant. Like that. It's a confusing rule. It doesn't come up very often, but I just want to make you aware when it does, you have that option whether to capture it or not. Now let's move on to one other, I think the greatest thing a pawn can do. And I'll tell you the truth, in many, many games, whether you're just a beginning player or you're a world-class grandmaster, this is something that is won game after game after game. This is probably the most powerful thing any piece can do on the board, and we'll get to that. Now we're going to cover, I think, probably the most amazing thing in chess, which you can do with a pawn, or any piece for that matter. I'll give you an idea. White moves, black moves, white moves, black moves, white moves, black moves, white moves, black moves, white moves, black moves. The pawns are marching down the board, as you can see. Black moves, white moves, black moves, white moves, black moves. Now, if you're lucky enough to get a pawn all the way down the board, as you can see here, he started here and now he's here. If he can get to the 8th rank, and the same goes for black, if he can get down here to the 8th rank, you can promote your pawn. And what that means is you can get any piece back you want. In fact, in some games, if you notice the new chess sets now that are sold, each side comes with 2 queens, and the beginners are wondering why 2 queens. You can get another bishop, you can get another rook, you can get another knight, and you can get another queen with that lowly pawn if he gets to the end without being captured. And the square he goes to is the last space. Let's illustrate. As you can see, queen. You can get another queen. Can you imagine that? Now let's try that again. If you want to, you can get a rook. Let's go back. If you want to, you can get a bishop. If you want to, you can get a knight. Now everyone 99 times out of 100, you would pick a queen. And the reason for that is, of course, the queen is the most powerful piece on the board. It does many, many things. It's extremely powerful. And we'll go into the movements of the queen later. But I just wanted to show you the power of the lowly pawn. That lowly pawn that sat probably back here during the course of a 2 or 3 hour game, doing nothing, all of a sudden when he saw his chance and has an open field, your pawn, if you make it to the final rank, the 8th rank, can become a queen or a rook or a bishop or a knight, but mostly a queen. And that's the only piece on the board you can do that with. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. I think it's great that the lowliest piece, the least powerful piece on the board, can become the most powerful piece on the board. And those of you that are beginning chess, especially children, remember that in your life as well. The next piece we're going to cover is the bishop. The bishop's a really useful piece. He can move in any diagonal direction. In other words, this bishop can move here, here, to here, or to here. Same with a dark squared bishop. And one other thing you'll see, sometimes you'll see dark squared bishop, light squared bishop. The bishops can never leave the color square from when they start originally. So this bishop here will always be on a dark space, and this bishop here will always be on a light space through the entire game, as long as they're on the board and not captured. One other thing I want to mention, the bishop cannot go through his own piece. In other words, this bishop cannot go to this square here that's highlighted because the black pawn is in the way. Now this bishop can go pretty much anywhere else. He can go here. He can go here. He can go here. He can move in almost any direction diagonally on the color space. And the bishop also captures the same way he moves. In other words, the bishop moved here, and this bishop moved here. This bishop can now capture this pawn. Every single piece, except for the pawns, capture the way they move. In other words, if the bishop moves diagonally, it captures diagonally. It just cannot go through its own piece or any other piece. It has to capture it. Give you an example. We'll move the bishop back here. We'll move this bishop here. And say white moved here. This bishop here cannot move to this space here. Reason being that this pawn is in the way. So he can do one of two things. He either can capture the bishop or he can move somewhere else. He cannot jump to this square here because the white bishop's in the way. Nothing can be in the way of the piece that's moving. So bishops, let's review. Bishops move diagonally in as many squares as they have room for, as long as there's nothing in the way, and they capture the same way that they move. Now let's move on to the next piece. Now we're going to cover what a lot of beginners think is the most difficult piece to understand, but once you really think about it, it's not, and that's the knight. The knight doesn't move in the same direction. I'll show you I'll illustrate what I mean. The knight moves 2 spaces over and 1 space up. One space up, 2 spaces over. Either way, in the shape of an L. I'll just move the king here to get rid of the arrows. Illustrate, I'll show you what I mean. This knight here, the white knight, can go to this square, this square, this square, this square, or this square, or this square. Any one of these squares this knight can go to. And as you can see, it's in the shape of an L. You go over 2, up 1. You can go over 1 this way, and that's the way the knight moves. The knight is the only piece, as you can see. In fact, I'll move the king again, get rid of the arrows. Normally, if this was a bishop here, he wouldn't be able to move because that pawn's in the way. He wouldn't be able to move in this direction because the pawn's in the way. If it was a rook, he couldn't move in this direction because the pawn's in the way. Well, the knight is a little different. The knight is the only piece on the chessboard that moves in an awkward L shape like that, but also the main characteristic of the knight is he can jump over other pieces. You can jump over your own pieces or your own pawn's pieces. To give you an idea, this knight can move to here. This knight can jump over this pawn. This knight can move to here. And that's the amazing power of the knight, is he can move in the shape of an L, one space over, two spaces up, or two spaces up and one space over. I'll illustrate again. This knight can move to any one of these squares. Granted, like any other chess piece, you can't move where your own piece is. It has to be a blank space or a space controlled by your opponent and you capture his piece. And that's the power of the knight. It's an amazing piece. It's really good in closed positions where there's a lot of pawns, where a lot of your pieces can't get through. Your knight can jump over and get in on the attack. And that is the amazing power of the knight. The next piece we're going to look at is the rook. The rooks begin in each corner at the beginning of the game. The rooks can move in any direction, horizontally or vertically. Let me show you what I mean. This rook can move here, here, or here. The same with this rook. He can move in any one of those squares. Same with the black rooks. I'll give you an idea. But this rook cannot move up here because his pawn is in the way. The same rule applies with the bishop. You cannot go through your own piece. You have to have a clear view. So let's do a couple of moves here. Let's move the rook there and move this rook here. Now this rook can go anywhere along here, any direction this way, and any direction this way, as long as another piece is not in the way. So this rook can go to any one of these squares. That rook can go to any one of those squares when it's his move. We'll move rook up. This rook can move over. Now this rook can move anywhere along this, here, file. So the black rook can move in any direction, vertical or horizontal, as long as nothing's in the way. And that's the way the rook moves. So let's move on to the next piece. Now we're going to cover the most powerful piece on the board, the queen. I've read some books in the past. The queen used to move one space back in medieval times, back in the 1400s, I believe. Reason being that they didn't want the female to be more powerful than the king, which is kind of funny actually. And as time went on, they allowed the queen to move any number of spaces that she wanted to move. To give you an illustration, I'm covering in yellow here all of the spaces that queen can move to. For the beginning players, to give you an idea, if you take what the rook can do, any number of spaces, there's nothing in the way, horizontally or vertically. And what the bishop can do, diagonally, as many spaces as there's room. You put both of those together, the power of the rook and the power of the bishop, and that's what the queen can do. And that's why it's the most powerful piece. It's a great attacking piece. It also is good for defending, but its main function is attack. And of course, you want to attack your opponent's pieces or your opponent's king to win the game. It's an amazing piece. The king is the most important, but the queen is the most powerful, and people confuse that. The king is the most important because if you lose him, you lose the game. You don't lose the game if you lose your queen. Usually you do, but it's not over immediately. So that is the awesome power of the queen. Now we're going to cover something that I don't think is covered in depth as much as it should, and that's the initial setup to begin the game. Now I want to mention, as you see on the screen here, my pieces are white and black, so it's very easy to determine what the light color pieces are. If you're playing with different color sets, whatever the lighter colors are, you would use that as white. The light colored pieces, that side moves first. So in this case it'd be white moves first. The light colored pieces always move first. And what you'll want to look for, if you see in the bottom right corner I just highlighted, is a light colored square. And there's also a light colored square on the other end, on the end of that diagonal. As you're sitting looking at the chess pieces on your side, the light colored square, no matter what colors your squares are, it doesn't matter. The light colored square has to go in the right corner. And as you can see from the black side of the board, if your opponent was sitting across from you, his right would also be a light colored square. That's very important. I can't even tell you how many dozens and dozens of movies I've seen with chess pieces set up where the dark colored square is in the corner. It makes me crazy. I want to call up the studio and say, hey, what are you guys doing? So that's very important. The light color pieces move first. In this case on the screen is white. And the dark color pieces move second. The light colored square, as I'm highlighting here, is in the right corner on your side, and the light colored square is on your opponent's side. That's important. Another trick to remember, if you see on the bottom of the board is A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. And then on the left hand side 1 through 8, it goes up the side of the board. A1 is always in the left hand side of the light colored pieces, in this case white. That's the easiest way to remember. Also I want to show you while we have the initial setup is the rooks always go in each corner, as you can see, on each side. The knight goes next to the rook on each side. See, the knights are on each side next to the rook. And then the bishop on each side is next to the knight. And the king and the queen, this is commonly messed up. This even on the movies, professionals. If you had the light colored pieces, in this case the bottom of the screen is the white pieces, the queen, the way to remember is the queen goes on her own color. In other words, if you have the light colored pieces, the queen goes on the light colored square. And if you look on the other top of the board, the black queen, or the dark colored pieces, goes on the dark square. The queen goes on her own color. And of course the only space left is for the king. So, easy way to remember: rook, knight, bishop, queen on her own color, and the right hand side corner is the light colored square. Now I'll go into a little bit here about what they call coordinates. As you can see here, this is the A file. It runs 1 through 8. This is the E file. See the E on the bottom next to the king, and this is on the bottom left hand side is an A. That's an A file. Later, as you get more into chess, you have to keep score. And to give you an idea, I'll highlight this square here. Now what you do is, if you looked on the left of the light colored square all the way over the edge of the board, you'll see the number 4. If you follow that highlighted square all the way down to the bottom, you'll see an E. The letter always comes first. That's the E4 square. And every single square has its own coordinates. You just look at the letters and look at the numbers. In other words, this case here, This square, if you look on the bottom, it says B. You look at the rank, it says 5. That's the B5 square. And that'll be very useful later. So to recap, the light colored squares in the right hand corner of each side, your opponent's as well as yours. The rooks go on each end. The knights go next to the rooks. The bishops are next. As you can see, everything's symmetrical with black. The queen, if you have a light colored queen or a white queen, either way, the queen goes on her own color. The white queen goes on the white square, and as you can see on the top, the black queen goes on the black square. And it leaves only one space left, and that's for your most important piece, and that's your king. And that's the setup for chess. Now we're going to move on to castling, which is one of the most important ideas in chess. What castling does, it helps protect your king, which of course if you lose your king, the game is over. And castling is one of the things that really helps with your king's safety. Now I want to say for some of the beginners out there, castling is the only time in chess where you're allowed to move your king more than one space and at the same time move a rook. Now, moving two pieces at the same time seems pretty absurd, but castling, you're allowed to do that. Now let me give you a little illustration. As you can see, I have both sides here empty. I have no other pieces. That's one of the requirements for castling. And you'll see when I go to castle that none of the pieces can be in your way. There can't be a knight here or a bishop here or a queen here or a bishop here or a knight here. They all have to be empty. Between your rook and your king, the area has to be clear. In fact, I'll just clear out the... Okay, we're just clearing out the arrows. Now you can castle on either side of the board. Castling on this side is called queenside castling because this is where the queen goes. It's the side of the queen. And this is called kingside castling because your king's on this side. Just to get rid of the arrows. Now, if you want to castle on the king side, especially if you're in a tournament game, it's important to realize you have to touch your king first. And what you do is you bring your king over two spaces. And once I let this king go, the rook will come over. The rook will be on this space, and the king will be on this space in the end. I move the king over, and then you pick up your rook and put him on the other side of your king. And that's what they call kingside castling. Now, if you look up on the top of the screen for black, you move your king over 2 and drop him, and then the computer does it automatically, but then you would move your rook on the other side of your king. And that's called queenside castling because that's on this side of the board. The left-hand side of the board is the queen side. Now let's go back. Say you're a white, you wanted to castle on the queen side. You'd move your king over 2 spaces, and then you bring your rook on the other side of your king, like that. If you were black, and you want to move on the king side to castle, you would castle king side. And that's how castling works. It's the only time you're allowed to move 2 pieces in the same move. One other rule with castling, let's go back here. If you moved this rook here, we'll say, and then moved him back to that square, you cannot use him for castling purposes anymore. Same goes with this rook. If he's been moved, even if he moved back to his original square, you can't use that rook to castle. Same goes for the king. If the king had moved here and then moved back, you can't castle. Once the king's been moved, you lose your right to castle. Same with the movements of the rook. Even if you move them and return them to their original squares, you cannot use them for castling. And once the king moves, you cannot castle after that, even if you return your king to the original square. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed the beginning lessons to open up the world of chess for you. Look for other videos as well for beginners and intermediate players in the coming weeks and months. Like I said before, chess is the greatest game in the world. Bye-bye.